more and more when people say I'm a leftist, it's increasingly irritating. And more when they say I'm a leftist, what I want to do is I want to reply to them and say, no, you're not. No, you're not a leftist, okay? You're not a leftist. You're not a leftist any more than an inquisitor in the Inquisition was a leftist, okay? There are what are called leftists today encompass two groups of people. One of them is the natural egalitarians. The natural egalitarians are basically communists of a sort, and they exist at all points in history. And it doesn't really matter the dominant ideology in which they exist. Okay, these kinds of people, natural egalitarians, would be communists basically, even if they're in Nazi Germany or even if they're in the United States. That's just how they are. That's just who they are. Some people say, well, it's because of the parenting or early childhood events or something. I think it's biology. I mean, a lot of this they could say, well, it's the way they're raised in a communal fashion with their siblings that influence their political views, or if it's a more individualist raising fashion like in Britain, that makes them more individualistic, which is why Britons are more individualistic. That's a lot of environmental pseudoscience. What I think that is. But anyway, so you have these natural egalitarians, these natural communists, we'll say, but on the other hand, but they're not most of them. The natural communists would be someone like Ujama Flipper. Okay, Ujama Flipper is a natural communist. He might not, whether or not he actually subscribes to Marxism or Marxist-Leninism or Maoist third world. I mean, that's not, I don't think he does, but by his temperament, he is clearly, he is a classic example of a natural communist. Now, of course, everyone is really along the spectrum, so I'm speaking about these groups of people as if they're pure types. Really, everyone exists along the spectrum, multiple spectrum, but I'm speaking as if these are pure types just for publicity. And so Ujama Flipper would be a great example of that kind of, natural egalitarian, natural communist. And just because you're a natural communist doesn't mean you'll actually subscribe to Communist Party, whatever. So, and these natural communists, they exist at all points in history, right? You had people trying to form communes in the Middle Ages, right? in feudal times, and then, of course, they had all sorts of religious justifications for them. You had communists in Nazi Germany, despite the zeitgeist being profoundly anti-communist. You had communists in the United States in the 1950s, despite the zeitgeist being profoundly anti-communist. So, you even had a few communists in Japan, in Imperial Japan, despite the zeitgeist in Imperial Japan being very anti-communist, anti-Soviet. So, so this type exists everywhere, and that's why I think it's largely a genetic thing. Maybe it's an early childhood thing. It could be that, but things tend to be genetic. Okay, now, most people, however, are not natural communists. Most people are just dogmatists. Today, I would call them universitarians, meaning they take whatever the fashionable opinions to come out of the social science departments in universities are, and that's what they believe. That's what they rationalize, that's what they defend, and that's what they believe. Now, everyone that I will call a universitarian, it's a matter of degree. Some people are worse than others, okay? It's similar to a religious person. Some people are worse than others. Some people are more dogmatic about their religion than others. And so I see progressivism, as it is sometimes called, they call it progressivism or liberalism or leftism. This all kind of hides what's really going on, okay? Their church is the university, specifically the University Social Science Department. Now, and I say this and, that's a really profound, inflammatory, and damning statement. Well, I think it's also pretty undeniable. It's not something that you can really argue against. When universities first came to be, they were basically to teach the clergy to run a parish. Over time, you had these, and they weren't called universities, they were called cathedral schools or monasteries. Sometimes they would have their own building and it'd all be enclosed. Sometimes they would just be, you have the professors. Yeah, that's where this term comes from. The term professor always sounded kind of cultic and Christian-y, and of course it is. And of course the very idea sounds a little cultic, but anyway. Early on, they wouldn't even have their own buildings. They'd have their own rented rooms and they would teach the old stuff. And over time, they became more established and more organized. They'd have their own buildings, their own rooms dedicated to teaching. At first, they would teach a few things that were necessary to run a parish, like geometry, obviously Latin, a lot of theology, a lot of understanding of the scriptures, astronomy, some law, in order to, because, you need to know these things in order to manage a parish. Probably some accounting, some basic math. And over time, though, these schools started to teach more secular things. They started to teach medicine, and they started to teach law, and then they started to teach philosophy. And of course, philosophy at the time was much broader than it is now. And of course, philosophy then branched off into, biology, chemistry. I can't think of much else. There's a ton of other stuff. Physics, But the beginning, it was all kind of one thing. It was all it was small enough that it could all be one thing. And over time, it began to branch off, specialize. So that's where these things came from. But then on the other hand, you had all these basically real science. You had real stuff on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you had theology, right? And this is what you had for a very long period of time. You had theology on the one hand. You would go to the university, which was very religious at the time, to either become priest or to become a real scientist or a real professional, right? Over time, theology went away. What replaced theology? Okay, Okay, so theology goes away, but as theology goes away, it gets replaced with social science, with what is called social science. Okay, so social science filled the void that theology left. This is not. This is true. This is not. You can't argue against. Okay, theology went away. Of course, I mean Harvard, for example, still has a theology department, but it's just one little thing now. It's not nearly as important as it was at founding of Harvard. In fact, that's why Harvard was founded. It was actually founded because there were no universities in the New World, and they were concerned that there would be no clergy in the New World. They wouldn't have anyone who could perform clerical duties after the generation of clerics had died in the New World. And this is not a big secret. This is actually on Harvard's About Them website. And look up. This is not, again, this is another not debatable thing. And you know, when you're dealing with universitarians, they'll argue, you know, forever. They'll argue a point forever. Okay? So they'll never quit, even when they're obviously wrong. So that's where universities came from. They evolved from the cathedral schools and monetary schools. And the social science departments of universities in particular are the successors to theology, basically. This is true. So when I say that these people who basically agree with whatever is fashionable in the social sciences, that these people are basically clinging to whatever the priesthood says, and they're the psychological analog to the people who clung to whatever the priesthood said, well, that should not be a very controversial statement. That's pretty obvious. You look at the development of the institutions. That's all. Okay. Now you can say, well, sure, but they're not clouded by religion, whereas previously they were clouded by religion, and that's what made it dogmatic in the past, whereas it's less dogmatic now. Granted, they're not burning people at the stake now, but of course, how much of that has to actually do with the university? I mean, I've seen plenty of hardcore university types calling to kill all quote-unquote racists. Right? I mean, they had heretics in the past. Burn the heretic, no, burn the racist, whatever they define as right. And they get to control what that is. Okay. And they have other terms, sexist, homophobe, but really racist is the big one. Okay. And what a lot of people I think forget is that, yeah, you know, you could say that, I would also say that the early theology of the Catholic Church, what a lot of people don't know is that there was a lot of secular dogma that the Catholic Church held to, that the Catholic Church clung to, especially in regards to Aristotle. You know, for example, Aristotle said that the heart was the seat of consciousness, and so that's where it stood for a long period of time. Aristotle said that heavier objects fell faster than lighter ones, and that's where the matter stood. Aristotle claimed that, just going off the top of my head here, what does Aristotle claim? Of course, we all know the classic example of the Earth as the center of the universe, but Aristotle also claimed that that meteors were within the Earth's atmosphere. There were a limited number of bodies, or like 54 spheres and 7 bodies. 54 heavenly spheres in 7 different bodies. He said things like, he said a lot of silly stuff that people believe. Also, Catholic Church held to the Galen/Hippocrates theory of humors, believing that blood was basically being generated and consumed at a very rapid rate, and that one would get sick because they had bad humor. They had bad humors, and so they needed the blood to be drained a little bit. They would get better. And so this is where, and of course that obviously didn't work. That's crank science, and that's where the matter stood. But that dogma was not biblical dogma. Now, in regards to the Earth being the center of the solar system, some could say, well, that was a biblical dogma. Well, no, maybe. No, that's kind of a just so story, right? What we know is that the church was really dogmatic about defending Aristotle, right? Which was not a Christian thing. It was a secular. They were secularly. They were in love with the secular ideas of the Greeks, who were pagan, and they loved everything Aristotle said. Aristotle said the Earth was the center of the universe, and lo and behold, they found some Bible passages to justify it. Okay, so you want to say that that what they did to Galileo, that was just a result of their religion? Well, maybe, but that's a just so story. My opinion is that it wasn't a result of their religion, that they just used religion to prop up Aristotle, to prop up their secular dogma. Anyway, but aside from that, there's a whole bunch of secular dogma that the church held, and that the church did not allow dissent, and would, they would blackball and ignore, and just all, you know the drill. You know the drill they do with, not quite as extreme as what they did with Galileo, but the same kind of thing. And so that's the problem, is that we have a whole lot of secular dogma that the church did. So when people say, all of the dogmatism of the old Catholic Church and all the dogmatism of the early university, which can trace its roots back to around 500 AD in Spain or not, that those ultra dogmatic roots, that's just a result of Christianity. That's not a secular thing. I'm not so sure. I mean, because they held a lot of secular dogma. So, and what we see is that the same basic structure has basically persisted since around 500 AD. Now, you go to the university, you have the professor, right? You still have the same name, the professor teaches courses courses, and at the end of these courses, you are granted the degree. You are the bachelor, whatever, the grand wizard, whatever title, and they give you a little funny cloak and cap or whatever, right? And we make fun of the Ku Klux Klan for dressing all funny ones, and it's this real weird medieval kind of pageant that they have. It's you look at it from the outside as you look at universities from the outside. Don't treat it as a normal thing, but treat it as an extension of the church, and it starts to look really weird. It starts to look a lot like a church when you look at it that way, and it really fits that way very well when you look at it that way. And the people that we have today, the people who fell for a lot of the bullshit of the Catholic Church, these are, genetically speaking, these are the same people we have today. They're the same people in the genetic aggregate. Obviously, they're not genetically identical man for man, but in the whole genome of the population aggregated, they're basically the same people. Yeah, you're right. We have better nutrition nowadays, and yeah, you're right. We have a more materialistic view of the world. Well, at least some of us do. Okay? I think it's great. I think it's hilarious when I talk about race and IQ, and I talk about gross morphology differences in the brain, basically making some sort of difference in cognitive function inevitable. Not necessarily that the biggest brain is going to be quote unquote smartest, whatever that means, but that if they're different in shape, well, they're probably going to be different in function. In fact, it's almost certain. What a weird coincidence would it be that if they're different in shape but precisely identical in function, right? Male and female brains aren't that way. And I'm not saying that males are quote unquote smarter, whatever that means, but the males and females obviously have different natures, right? And they have radically different brain size and shape, right? And so you look at the races, they have differences in brain size and shapes. Africans and Europeans have differences in brain size of roughly the same magnitude as the genders do. So to say that there's going to be no difference, I mean, if you want to say, oh, blacks are going to be quote unquote smarter because their brains are shaped differently, and I think that this makes them, that's a more sensible view, right? That's at least saying that's at least living in the physical materialistic universe, as opposed to saying, oh, they're going to be equal because intelligence is this magical, ho ho, it's magic, right? So I think it's funny is that these so-called hardcore materialists suddenly revert to the mystery of the mind, the non-material mind, as soon as you start talking about getting into race differences in cognition stuff. Anyway, that's a bit of a digression though. But we're at a genetic level, we're dealing with the same kinds of people who fell for the bullshit of the Catholic Church. Okay, so and you need to wonder what kind of people would fall for the bullshit of the Catholic Church. Well, I think it's obvious. It's the kind of people who are going to fall for the bullshit of social sciences. The social sciences are the heirs to the church. Okay? You could say that the Protestant church, the mainline Protestant church that people go to once a week, they're the heirs of the church, right? And so what we need to do is we're going to throw all of their, all of that baggage of that history on the backs of, of these little churches. I want to say mom and pop churches, but that's so silly, okay? Because the university system has a much closer tie to the Catholic Church. In fact, the Protestant churches actually broke off from the Catholic Church. They founded themselves, these people were in fact ex-Catholics, okay, fine, but they founded their churches, semi-independently, especially if you're getting into more modern. I forget what denomination the group of people that founded Harvard and Yale were. They were not Catholics, but the university system itself, that is a Catholic thing. That goes back to the Pope. So and so these people who say, well, we're atheists and we're completely, their cathedral is the university, and it really is a cathedral, and it's they say that they're not falling for a bunch of dogma because it's all secular, but there's no reason to believe that. There's no reason to believe that it's any different this time. Okay? You have almost the same thing going on. You have people, and like with the old churches, the people who would go to become priests or go to the cathedral schools, become doctors of the law. These are all smart people, okay? And so that was a real problem because a bunch of smart people went to these institutions and thus gave these institutions prestige. Because if you have a bunch of really smart engineers who are repeating a bunch of the dogma you brainwash them with, in the first year, as when they were taking the core curriculum in the college, that adds a lot of prestige to your university, but it also adds a lot of prestige to the ideology associated with that, right? If you can convince them, for example, to support universal healthcare, you can brainwash the soon-to-be engineers to support universal healthcare. It's like, wow, we have these really smart people supporting universal healthcare. They must have really researched it. They must have really looked into it. Well, no, not necessarily, right? Because you have these engineers, they're spending their time studying for their engineering classes and playing Xbox. That's what they're doing. Okay, they don't have time. They do have time, but they don't have the extra energy or desire to, by and large, to look up these things. And what they assume, a lot of hard science people assume, is that the social sciences, quote unquote, are rigorous in the same way that the hard sciences are. Right? So people are engineers, and they imagine that the social science people are just as rigorous as them, or maybe not just as rigorous, but rigorous to some degree. They greatly overestimate the rigor of the social sciences. The social sciences, they have all the rigor of a theologian, right? And of course, they can speak incomprehensibly. That's true, okay? But then again, so can the theologians. They can have all sorts of citation methods, but so can the theologians. Okay? They can have all sorts of titles, right? But so do the theologians, okay? In fact, if you look at the whole way the university system is set up with all these titles and all of this jargon and all of this seniority and all of this crap, it reeks of the church. It reeks of the hierarchical institutional nature of the Catholic Church. It reeks of it. It is such a fitting parallel to it that, so now of course there's no real way to verify or falsify this, but the parallels just pop out at you. You don't have to dig very deep to find them. The university system is the modern day church. And moreover, and another thing I want to say is that the university system, 95% of what you learn, of what students learn in the university system is not going to help them in a job. One. Two, the work that you do in a university doesn't prove work ethic for a job, because, you're at a university, you're going to class and studying on average about 24 hours as opposed to 40 hours. And also, it's not real work. So, it doesn't prove, so they say it shows work ethic. Well, I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think it shows work ethic. I think it shows a little bit of work ethic, but not as much as having a regular job would. It doesn't provide skills that are useful for the job. Perhaps writing helps. Maybe, okay, writing helps, but what do they actually teach? Do they actually teach, excellent writing? Well, there's a few creative writing classes. That may help, okay? But mostly what they're doing is they're teaching Old English, and they're teaching really crappy books. Like we read Catcher in the Rye, and we read The Bean Trees, and that doesn't help. That doesn't help in a job, or doesn't help in work performance. In fact, there's been studies on this that basically prove what I'm saying, that once you control for IQ and an integrity test, education doesn't really matter, except for really technical things. And moreover, and let's say you have really technical things. Oh, there's a few technical things, and that proves the need for college. Well, does it really? Does it really? I mean, for example, to be a petroleum engineer, what do you need to do? Well, you need to learn what is relevant to becoming a petroleum engineer. That's it. That's it. It's not written on the heavens that you have to go to a university to do so. All you have to do is learn a certain skill to do a certain job. That's it. That's it. Now, it may be a lot. It may take a long time. It may take a year to learn all that stuff. Okay, but you don't have to take English classes. You don't need to take philosophy classes to be a petroleum engineer. You don't need to spend all that money at a university to be a petroleum engineer. You don't need any of that. That system of the university predates the easy access to books. Okay? In 500 AD, the reason people would travel to university, instead of just reading a book and learning from a book and then going somewhere to take an exam, right? The reason they would travel to a place to take courses was because books were so expensive. Okay, so this idea of taking courses, now maybe for little kids, you need a teacher because kids aren't going to be self-motivated or whatever. But in terms of people who are self-motivated, the reason that the university system was set up the way it was because they didn't have access to books. Okay, and so as soon as books became relatively cheap, that should have been the end of the university system, but of course it wasn't. And of course the university system now, with the advent of the telegraph, should have been made obsolete again. With the advent of the radio, obsolete again. The advent of television, obsolete again. And with the advent of internet, obsolete again 1,000-fold. So, but of course it sticks around, and the reason it sticks around is not because it provides an actual useful thing. This can be seen in Harvard security. Okay? Harvard doesn't have strict security for people getting into classes to listen to what the professor says, take notes on what the professor says, and get all that information. Right? Harvard doesn't have any security on that. Harvard doesn't have any security on what is supposedly its product. Harvard has security on the degrees. Harvard has security on its database, on its computer system, records of people going to Harvard and getting the degree. Okay, people don't. I mean, there's less of a demand for people trying. I mean, if you could sell a Harvard education without the degree, there'd be a few people who would take, but most people wouldn't take. Right? However, if you could, sell the Harvard degree, and of course part of that would be you hacking into the database and creating a record that you were there and all that stuff, that would be extremely valuable, and that would land jobs. Right? The degree does, right? And so that's where Harvard security is. It's on the actual degree itself, not on the actual education, which is supposed to be the whole point. Right? The whole point is supposed to be that you get this education, and this education is going to make you such a better person that you're going to be this much more valuable to employers, that you're going to make a whole lot more money. Okay, that's what it's supposed to be. Okay, supposedly. But the fact that there's very little to do to prevent people from actually getting into classes and just sitting in, right? They just deny them the degree at the end of the term, is evidence that that's not what people go to Harvard for. They don't go to Harvard for the education. They go to Harvard degree. Right? They go to Harvard for the title, and then employers look at this title and hire them, right? And so that's evident. And so when I say, and so if universities are that way, they're not really providing real value. That would explain why universities were able to persist once books became widely available, and it further explains why these universities are able to persist in the age of internet. Okay, because the education doesn't matter. The education is not the point. What it is a system of status, right? And this is, I mean, it is the ultimate in the worst we say about corporate rot, seniority mentality, old ways mentality, institutional mentality, titles mentality, all right? The university is the ultimate of that, right? It does not provide, overwhelmingly, it does not provide any real job skill or job performance ability. It does improve work ethic. People don't value the education in and of itself. They value the degree, right? They want to get the degree, right? That's what's going to get them jobs, okay? That explains why the university system is able to persist in the age of books, when we have books. Because you can actually get the university education through books just fine. Like, you don't need to spend a whole lot of money going to college. But, but you don't get, so which is evidence that the point of the university is not the education itself. The point is the status center. So, yeah, it's a church. There's very little good to say about it. There's very little that is redeeming to say about it's a bad institution. It's a bad app. Now, there's going to be a problem here because there's a lot of good teachers. There's a lot of professors at universities who are good professors. And you know what? Friar Tuck from Robin Hood was a good priest. Was a good friar. Yeah, he was Friar Tuck. He was friar. Right. So he was a good friar. Okay. We know of a good bishop. Know of a good cardinal or something. Maybe a few less of those. But don't confuse that with the system itself. Don't confuse your good teacher, your good professor who takes a genuine interest in his students and he's a cool teacher and he's your friend and all that stuff. Don't confuse that with the system that he operates in. Right. Don't and when you say, oh well, university is a great system because all these smart people went to it and learned all these smart things. Don't no, you don't need to go to a university to learn advanced calculus, okay? Like there's nothing inherent in the history of Harvard or in the brick and mortar of Harvard, probably not even anything inherent in the teachers at Harvard that make one better at calculus. In fact, if you look at voucher studies, kind of at a lower level, variance in teaching quality is really not that important. What matters in terms of learning calculus is overwhelmingly the student, right? And if you have a good student, well, it doesn't matter if he goes to Harvard or Podunk State. Calculus is pretty standard. So, what's the deal? The deal is there's an aura, an institution, and so, but people, they see smart people going to college, and so they think, oh, well, college must be like this really valid thing because there's so many smart people coming. Well, you could have made the same argument about the church because that's where all the smart people went back then, the church. And they became, and way back before they had medical schools and law schools, they went to the church only to become priests, right? So all the smart people would become priests, okay? So that conferred a lot of credibility on the church. Because, oh, look, we're all the smart people, all the learned people. And that's true. That's true. The people who were in the church, monastery, cathedral system were, generally speaking, more intelligent than the people who weren't. That doesn't make it a good system, right? Same thing with the university today. Yeah, you're right. It is, in fact, where all the smart people go. I get that. I get all the smart people who are there, okay? But that doesn't make it a good system. I'm kind of rambling here, so I'm just going to end this video here.